On behalf of the Nantucket Historical Association, welcome. My name is Jocelyn Wong, and I'm the Community Outreach Coordinator here at the NHA. Tonight, NHA Chief Curator and Obed Macy Research Chair Michael Harrison will introduce and discuss our special exhibition that is soon to open. The show Summer on Nantucket, A History of the Island Resort, will open at the Whaling Museum on Friday, May 26th, next Friday. Michael Harrison has held curatorial positions at the National Building Museum, the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, and the Glasgow Museum of Transport. He is the author of numerous books and articles, as well as nearly 70 historical reports on maritime, architectural, and engineering topics for the U.S. National Park Service's Heritage Documentation Programs. He is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and holds a master's degree in museum studies from the George Washington University. Without further ado, please welcome Mike Harrison.
Thank you very much, and welcome. So as you will have gathered, and that what brought you here this evening is that our major summer exhibition here at the Whaling Museum this year is about summer itself. And so what I wanted to do tonight was sort of walk you through some of the story points and show you some of the artifacts that we're going to be featuring in the exhibition. I'm not going to talk quite as much about the process of developing the exhibition. That's a little bit about, talking about Zoom meetings and sitting in rooms. I'd much rather tell you about, aspects of summer and some of the aspects that we have artifacts around, and some of the different ways of looking at summer that we hope to show to visitors in the gallery. And so I guess the first thing I would ask people is, what do you think of if somebody says summer on Nantucket? What are the impressions that might come to mind? And we thought about this ourselves in developing the show, and we've put together an entire wall of the exhibition of a variety of artifacts that represent ideas about summer. The old mill, these historic buildings, the places that you might go and see here, going to the beach and doing activities at the beach or seeing people at the beach, going to your favorite restaurants. Maybe the Moby Dick Inn was a place that you went in the past, or you might have favorite places now. Certainly, what people wear and what people carry to signify that they're part of the Nantucket scene, such as lightship baskets, are a big part of summer here. Or maybe you spend time at the Yacht Club or the Westmore Club or one of the other sort of social gathering places on an island. Maybe you own an Alarian sailboat and you go racing with it. Or you support one of the local theaters, or maybe you go to one of the golf courses. There's just many aspects of this that I think we could all sort of name our favorite ones, our favorite impressions, our favorite rose-covered cottage from the island. But then maybe this comes to mind. Exactly. Maybe you think more like, oh, summer, geez. You might not be the first person to think that. Does this sound familiar to anyone? Not a new sentiment. This might seem familiar to people as well. If anybody's ever had the privilege of putting their passenger car on the freight boat, I can highly recommend this experience. Maybe this also sounds familiar and comes to mind if you think about Nantucket summer. This has been on people's minds for a long time. Let's do another one. Anybody want to throw out a date? All right, so we all know this story. We all know that, in fact, the island has been wildly successful at being a summer destination, and that the demand to be here has had impacts on all kinds of aspects of the island. It has had impacts on real estate prices, it's had impacts on land use, it's had impacts on quality of life. It's both really good news, and it's also news that's maybe not quite so good that we're still grappling with on a local level. And so in our exhibition about summer on Nantucket, we want to talk about sort of both sides of this, that the island has a history to summer. It didn't come out of nowhere. It's not an unalloyed thing, that there are very positive, happy things we can celebrate about it, and then there are issues that we grapple with and that connect both seasonal people and local residents to try and solve these things together. And so the exhibition absolutely deals with these issues. And so the question then is, how did we get here? How did we come to be in this room together celebrating summer on Nantucket? And really the story starts with the end of whaling. And anybody who might recognize the boat in front of you and the boat on the screen buried in the sand are the same type of American whaling boat. Nantucket's whaling industry really started to decline in the late 1840s. They could see the writing on the wall. They could see that this was not going to remain a primary whaling port for terribly much longer. And in the 1850s, it truly collapsed. And though there's much discussion about the final whaling voyage from Nantucket leaves in 1868, that's irrelevant. By the end of the 1850s, whaling here is dead. And the local people, those who remain, many people move away. Those who remain ask themselves, what is going to be our economic engine next? What else can we replace whaling with? Well, we are an island. Water always has to do with things here. So there were attempts to set up a commercial fishing fleet. This is actually the builder's half model for the Charlotte Brown, one of the Nantucket Fishing Company's schooners from the 1860s. The sheep had been here all along, being raised and altering the local landscape. Their numbers increased. There was a return to farming and agricultural pursuits. There were also limited efforts to do industry. What could we make here? So the large Quaker Meeting House on Main Street was converted into a straw hat factory in the 1853, turning out straw hats. That lasted for a little while, but there was no way that the island's entire economy could be hung on that hat. But what do we have in abundance? We have sand, we have summer breezes, we have beautiful, beautiful vistas. And this was recognized early on. The Nantucketers are talking in the 1840s about how beautiful it is here and maybe we can get people to come. And this is a painting by William Trost Richards. He visited it in the summer of 1865. In fact, sort of used the landscape here to help sort of rethink the kind of art that he was making, a sort of luminist vision of how to capture light and the sky. Some debate as to whether this is the end of Sackja Pond or the end of Hummock Pond or Long Pond, but in any respect, we will all recognize this as a Nantucket beach scene and something that the locals realized they had in abundance to try and bring people here. And so beginning in the 1840s, there were already rooming houses here. There were plenty of accommodations for visiting sailors and for business people. But the first two hotels built specifically with recreational visitors in mind were what's currently known as the Jared Coffin House, the Ocean House on Broad Street, converted from a residence in 1847. And then the Atlantic House in Sconset, which is the lower photo, which opened in 1848 and was in operation until 1821. These are sort of the beginnings of thinking, wait, we could have a new economic engine. It can be based on people coming here to enjoy the summer. And I want to just go through very quickly a bit of a portfolio of some of these hotels and rooming houses that are developed. Many of them put into existing buildings. This is on Orange Street. This is what was called the Bayview House because the back of the house looks out at the harbor, and the front of it this was a grand merchant's residence or sea captain's residence, more likely, turned into summer accommodations. Everyone will recognize the Veranda House, sometimes known as the Overlook, that burned down last year and is being rebuilt. This is at Surfside. When the Surfside development was not successful at selling off cottage lots, they actually imported a second-hand hotel building from the mainland, which is this, and put it up, and it was destroyed by the winter weather in 1899. One of my favorites, the Nantucket Hotel on Brant Point, built in the 1880s. The center mass of this, some of you will know this, the center mass of this hotel is the former Straw Hat Factory on Main Street. Prior to that, the former Friends Meeting House on Main Street, now the Dreamland Theater. So that building has moved all over the island and was the hotel center section from the 1880s and 90s. This hotel also suffered greatly from the weather on Brant Point and had to be taken down. This is out in Sconset. And then we've got the Seacliff Inn on Cliff Road. This used to be visible from the oldest house. Imagine standing at the oldest house and being able to see the harbor and the hotels between you and the harbor. This was one of the ones there. The White Elephant, which we all know is still here. And then the beach house in Sconset. When you think of Sconset, this is not the view you think of anymore, that there would be a giant wooden hotel standing above you when you're on the beach. And I think this represents really well for me the idea that summer on Nantucket involves change, that what it was in the past and what it is in the present are not always the same. There are aspects of it that are the same, and there are other aspects that have changed. And this is definitely something that we're really interested in our exhibition. And of course, not everybody stays in a hotel. There is a strong and long history of the housing here being used for people coming to visit. And one could do an entire exhibition and multiple publications on the history of housing on Nantucket and its reuse for the summer economy. So here we have a typical historic period house in town. This is at the top of Hussey Street. This is the house that was known in early tourist times as Wisteria Lodge, because it was covered in beautiful wisteria that unfortunately is no longer there. Other choices, you could get a place in Sconset. This is one of the Underhill cottages from the 1880s in Sconset. You could build on Cliff Road or Brant Point. There is an entire history to people coming and saying, well, you know, I don't really want an antique house, so where should I put my new house? And today we think, well, you put your new house wherever you can buy a piece of property, anywhere on the island. But that was not the case historically. Anywhere on the island was difficult to get to, except for just outside of Sconset or just outside of town. And so Brant Point and Lincoln Circle and sort of these areas developed first with new buildings catering to summer long-term residents. This house, this is Sand and Weed, all written as one word as if it were some Norwegian or Scandinavian word, which still stands out overlooking the entrance to the harbor. Then you have Sconset, the outskirts of Sconset. Suburban development there was a big thing in the end of the 19th century. This is the house known as Sunny Cliff on Baxter Road. Getting a little more up to date, this is the former Pink House out at Pulpus that unfortunately no longer survives, but predates the historic district when outside of town you could build whatever kind of house suited your needs. And this was actually quite a spectacular mid-century open ranch house design on a stunning and very historic spot overlooking Pulpus Harbor. And so it is somewhat of a loss that it's not there anymore. And then I love this example. This is the Upside Down House. I mean, this particular one is not the Upside Down House. This is one of many Upside Down houses on Nantucket where the main living rooms and the kitchen are all on the second floor to take advantage of the view, and all the bedrooms are on the first floor because you don't need to be looking out at the ocean while you're asleep. And so there's a whole history of where do we build houses if we want a house and we're not going to stay in a hotel, what do those houses look like, and then how has those houses been changed by the idea that, oh wait, the island's changing too quickly, how do we preserve our historic look and our historic heritage, and the sort of the HDC process and all of that with preservation is definitely part of the exhibition that we talk about, and it all comes from choosing summer as an economic engine. I wanted to make just a quick comment about development here. So I mentioned the hotel that blew down in 1899 at Surfside. This is the plan from 1873 of the proposed cottage development at Surfside. A group of investors, most of them local, a few of them being having part of a local family who moved off island, the Coffins. They owned all of this land on the South Shore. And in the 1870s, when it really looked like the tourist economy would take off, and they were just beginning to build more hotels in town, they looked at the vineyard, and they were like, you know, the cottage city and the vineyard and these other cottage cities elsewhere in the United States are doing really well. We could do that on Nantucket and make a mint. And so there were a number in the 1870s, particularly, of spots remote on the island where large tracts of land were subdivided into tiny lots to sell off as summer cottages. And all of them failed. All of them had virtually no sales. And that's largely a transportation story. That in 1875, if you want to have a house out in Nantucket, it's a fairly big investment to get to a house in Nantucket. And then once you're out there, there are no amenities. And that's great if you're a farmer or a recluse, but it's not great if you're coming here for the summer season. So the people at Surfside realize this, and they build the railroad. They're the ones who develop the railroad from town down to Surfside, and then they extend it to Sconset, because people want to go to Sconset because it's actually there. And that whole history of the Nantucket Railroad is also a response to summer and a response to trying to monetize these lots and get development outside of town. And it all doesn't work, and I invite you to come to Hadwin House this summer, where we're doing a map exhibit on these failed subdivisions, including Surfside. You can see this very plan. It's much more interesting up close, where you can see what they're proposing, all of these, like, City Beautiful, Burnham design kind of things. It doesn't work until there are paved roads and automobiles. And it really is after World War II that we start seeing significant development on Nantucket out anywhere, and not just the outskirts of Sconset, which you can get to on the railroad, or the outskirts of town, which you can just walk to. So the other part of the economic engine is you have to be able to get here. And there's a lot of agitation in the 1860s and 70s, particularly in the early 1870s, on 2 boats a day in summer. Please, can the steamship company please provide 2 boats a day so that people can get here and people can get away? During whaling times, when we have big whaling ships headed off around the world, if you're a local business person and you want to go somewhere, there's a whole fleet of coasting schooners and sloops that will take you anywhere you want to go. And the island is super well connected to all the major ports on the East Coast, and is even connected to ports in Europe by this small sailing vessels. And visitors who come here, or Maria Mitchell's relatives who want to come visit in the 1840s, they're all taking these small sailing vessels. And that does not work for sparking a tourist economy and keeping it going. It's the steamships that they're going to rely on. And so in 1873, they finally get the New England Steamship Company to do 2 boats a day in season. And it really sort of helps then to boost things here. One of those tour early hotels that I showed you, the Jared Coffin House, previously called the Ocean House, that was actually converted into a hotel by the New England Steamship Company in order for their clients, there was a hotel that they could sell, that they could sell rooms to. But of course, we all know it's not just boats anymore. The airport is obviously a big, big part of the transportation scene here now, along with, of course, there's freight boats, there's the High Line, high-speed service. It may surprise you to learn that 3 boats a day did not start until the 1930s. And then today, between traditional ferries and the high-speed ferries, we have 26 boats a day coming and going. And 67,000 automobiles are carried to the island every year, 50,000 trucks, and nearly 1 million passengers. And that's just the water numbers. That's not the air numbers. Only 1 in 5 people come to island by air. Another aspect of this story that we do highlight in the exhibition is actually actively selling that you might want to come here, and actually promoting it. And the railroad and the steamship company did a lot of this work for the local islanders. The islanders were always happy to try and get, visitor comes and then gets a happy puff piece published in their newspaper back in Illinois. There's a lot of that, but it really is the steamship company, which is owned by the railroad, that does a lot of this promotion. So this is a poster from 1925. The artist John Held, who was famous for doing like New Yorker covers and painting, stereotyped, caricatured, I should say, representations of flappers and people partying in the 1920s. He was hired by the New Haven Railroad in 1925 to do this sort of fantastical scene of Nantucket. This appeared then throughout that railroad system's stations, and they published a little tourist book, Why You Should Come to Nantucket, that had this on the cover in 1925. And so you see, as you so often see with Nantucket, whaling is the background. Whaling is the talisman of history that's going to bring you here, why you want to come and visit our quaint, surviving seaport. But then the town itself offers you, beauty and recreation, and it may be a little hard to see, but in the middle of this are 2 fashionably dressed people playing tennis. There's a little automobile, really hip mid-1920s automobile. There's a little activity on the water. And the other weird thing is, of course, Lower Main Street is actually depicted behind Upper Main Street in this view. So it's really not, it's all fantasy. But pretty great. This poster, we just got a copy of it earlier this year, thanks to the assistance of the Friends of the NHA. One of a number of Friends acquisitions that are recent that are in the exhibition. So we're very excited to be showing this off. And then similarly, this is another piece from the railroad. different year earlier in the 1920s where we have this fashionably dressed modern man who's come to the island. He's seeking advice or guidance from the local crusty fishermen. There is an entire literature on the fiction of the local crusty New England fishermen, which I can send to people if they're interested. But what I particularly like about this brochure is that this is the cover of the brochure, and you open it, and there she is painting in the background. And so the art scene here and the idea that you want to encourage people to come and paint scenes and enjoy the landscape and capture that sort of quaint atmosphere of the island, that's also a big part of having Nantucket as a tourist economy. And this kind of imagery appears throughout brochures for decades and decades about how beautiful it is and how quaint it is and how and why you'd want to come here. And what this gets down to is that, the summer economy is really a construction and real estate economy. We think a lot about tourism and about tourism dollars and about people coming here, as if this were a mere tourist destination. But it really is, it's the fact that it's a summer resort where it's people who come and they buy second homes and they stay for extended periods of time and other people are here for a week or so. It has created the economic engine that is all about real estate and construction and the service industry. If you line up the numbers about sort of what's going into the economy on Nantucket, things like T-shirt sales or sort of food sales, fast food, that kind of thing, that's a drop in the bucket compared with real estate exchange, construction, landscaping, architectural design. These are sort of the really, really big numbers here. And it really is just, in the billions of dollars in terms of these things. And, providing, there's actually so much work to do and people willing to pay to have it done that there aren't enough people on island to do this work. And we import a great deal of the labor necessary to keep up with the demand for the summer to be ready, for the island to be ready for the summer. And there are complaints about that. There are complaints about, the people from the Cape are taking our local jobs. But actually, the history of the island, going back to nearly the 1690s, is there's never been enough people here to do the work that the economy has demanded be done. And Nantucketers, Nantucket business leaders, have been importing labor since before the American Revolution. The whale ships never, almost never, one should never overgeneralize, it wasn't just Nantucketers on these vessels. It's people that they're hiring to come in. And so this is part of a long and important tradition here that I think is worth recognizing. And the idea of all the materials coming in and all the companies, and so we've borrowed a lot of items from local construction companies, hats and things from landscaping companies and that to put in the show to sort of contrast with, yes, coming to the beach here is a big deal, but what makes that possible? What actually keeps that experience possible from one year to the next? And as I mentioned, historic preservation has become a very big deal here to try and protect the feel and the allure of the island. The original impetus to get the first two historic districts created in 1955 explicitly said it's all about economics. It's all about preserving the goose that laid the golden egg. You don't want to disturb that or people will stop coming. And lots of effort over more than half a century has gone into that and into debates about how far do you go with that and what does it mean for the entire island to be a landmark district when at the same time the entire island is a summer playground. And so we have some objects related to that. These are, everybody will probably be familiar with Building with Nantucket in Mind, the guidebook that you should use when thinking about renovating or building a new house here, the very restricted palette of approved colors for painting the exterior of your house, and then the predecessor to Building with Nantucket in Mind is the Historic District Guidebook, which I can highly recommend reading if you want a really interesting old-fashioned view of the history of the island. Then there's even a conservation story to this. There's so much demand for a place to be in the summer, to have your own part of the island, that this has led to the risk of overdevelopment and has led to both private and town efforts to preserve and protect open space. And these efforts have been so successful that if you count protected lands held by the land bank and by the Conservation Foundation and the other nonprofits, as well as like town land that's unlikely to be developed, you end up with 60% of the island. More than 60% of the island is protected from development. Incredible success. And at the same time, more than 76% of all the houses currently standing on the island have been built since 1960. So there is this tension. What kind of island do we want, and how far are we willing to let the summer economy go? And then how much do we pull back? And then even protecting all this land, then how do you afford to have any land that's available for local people to build? And there's like this complex whole thing, and I would love to do a future whole exhibition about this topic. But this is definitely part of the summer story, that we've worked hard to preserve it, and then there's that tension that's going on. But I want to get back then to something that's a little more, I'm sorry this is getting weighty with all of these heavy local issues. So let's go back to the beauty of the island and this wonderful 1865 painting. Once you're here, what are you going to do? What is there to do in Nantucket? Why do people come here? People come here because of this. I certainly come here because of this. But many of the beaches have amenities. There's a whole history to where you go to the beach on Nantucket. We think now that almost any beach on island is accessible, and everybody has their favorite one, and all the locals are familiar with which one is Ladies Beach, which one is Radio Tower Beach, which one is, everybody knows them. They're all named today. And that wasn't the case in the past. In the past, you generally went to the beaches on the North Shore. You went to the ones around what we now call jetties, but there wasn't always a jetty there. So Cliffside Beach, the beach at the cliff, the beach on the harbor, the clean shore. Everybody knows the clean shore, right? Anyway, that was, there's a couple different interpretations for that, but generally that's where Children's Beach now is, and there were bathing establishments there. This is out at what is now Jetties. This is Hayden's Bathhouse, one of its many iterations, and this particular painting, it's a little hard to see in the slide, but you can see the steamship coming in, you can see the lighthouse on Brant Point, you can see the beginnings of the big houses on Brant Point, you can see the Lillian catboat, which carried people out to the beach from the center of town. This is a painting done from life by a summer visitor in the 1890s. We've rarely had this on exhibit because it needs some conservation. We are having it conserved, and it's going to be in the show. I'm super excited about that. But the beach is a huge deal here. And let me tell you, we've got beach photographs in the collection. We've got all kinds of people at the beach, all kinds of things to wear at the beach, hijinks to do at the beach. We have exactly one bathing costume in the collection. If you have in your grandparents' attic other historic bathing costumes, please get in touch. We would love to expand our palette, but we have this lovely one from the beginning of the 20th century, which is going on exhibit. Maybe the beach isn't always your thing, or maybe you're sunburned, but you still want to be on the water. Water activities obviously are a huge deal here. We did a whole show about boats a few years ago. We're not repeating that, but the sort of recreational side, which has a lot to do with fishing, whether that's shore casting or it's going out with a professional guide on deep water fishing. Those are big things that one might do here and significant parts of the economic engine. But maybe you want to go on a tour. Maybe you want to see the other sites, and maybe you need somebody local to help you. There's a long history here of people available to help you. Go see the sites. Captain Folger is credited with the first motor bus tour company on Nantucket. He ran a motor bus garage for more pedestrian purposes, but this is J. Butler Folger. But then he got permission from the town in 1928 to set up sightseeing buses, and he styled himself Captain Folger. He was not actually a sea captain. He just called himself Captain Folger because it had a nice ring and a nice air to the old whaling history. But then a second cousin of his, Clinton Folger, who also ran a bus company, he also decided to get in on this act, and his bus line was Admiral Folger's. So this is, you would think that this was a sandwich board. This is actually only half a sandwich board, because if you have a bus and you step out of the bus, you just need to lean it against the bus. This is that, and it's got all the sites you might see, the cost of the thing. It's really great. That's in the show. What's Captain Folger gonna take you to? Well, maybe he's gonna take you to see the mill. Just as his predecessors had. There were many people who ran carriages and wagons. This guy was a captain. Captain William Baxter was very famous for giving colorful tours from his horse-drawn wagon, taking people out to the mill. People then love to take their picture with the mill. As you can see, people love to take their picture with the mill. Can you see the mill off to the side? Maybe you'll go to the mill. Maybe the mill. Or perhaps the mill. I don't mean to be funny. We do have a lot of these photographs. And I want to say that while I will be the first person to talk to you about how whaling has become this like symbol of the island, and that wherein historically you would never have had whales painted on signs or painted in shop windows, and today, of course, you do, and you put it on like men's trouser belts and on handbags and all this stuff, and we think that the whale is therefore the symbol of Nantucket. I would argue that prior to about the last 30, 40, maybe 50 years, it's the windmill that's the icon of Nantucket. The thing that you use to sell the island to the tourists. I mean, what signifies Nantucket? It's the windmill. The windmill is on souvenirs, it's on porcelain plates, it's on silver spoons, it's on photographs, it's on postcards, it is on everything. And so in jest, I show you 5 pictures of the mill, but really, there are lots of pictures of the mill on everything. We are doing a wheel of silver spoons in the exhibit that are all old mill souvenir spoons, because there are so many of them. And obviously, the mill is not the only thing there is to go see. We are doing a couple of different presentations in the exhibit about different sites that you might have seen at certain points in time, things about the lighthouses, and various other sites to see. I'm just here going to very briefly show you a couple of things that you might have done in the past that you might not do now, and that again goes to this idea that summer here does change. The beach may be a constant, but what the sites are that you might go see, some of those do change. And so the Athenaeum was famous in the 19th century for having a museum room with a custodian. For a long time, that was Mr. Henry Clapp. And they had collected from the local community many curiosities, natural history specimens, things brought back from the Pacific, seashells, Native American artifacts, just a whole range of things, the Cabinet of Curiosities model. These collections were there until 1905, when the Athenaeum decided that they needed more room for books, and then there was a museum down the street by that point, and they gave their entire they gave their natural history specimens to the Murray Mitchell, and they gave all their historical collections to the NHA. So you don't go see the Athenaeum Museum anymore, you can come to us. And in fact, the giant jawbone that's behind everyone here in this room is the same one that's in this photograph from the Athenaeum. And we have many objects from the Athenaeum collection here. Possibly you'd go see the Nantucket Historical Association after 1894. This is one of the early displays from my predecessors. There's a certain allure to doing exhibits like this, and there's a certain dread that someone would ask me to do an exhibit like this. It's great stuff, but does it tell a story? Not sure. But it was a big tourist draw, and it was open only in the summer. Whaling Museum from 1929. Nantucket Historical Association founded its own whaling museum, bought the building that's in the next room here, set this up, also only open in the summertime. And then one thing that I think is quite important about the history of summer here, and something that in certain ways is definitely not done anymore, is that people would come to Nantucket looking for this sense of history to go along with the beautiful landscapes. And it would be recommended to people that they go see and meet the local characters. Go try and meet Captain so-and-so. Go try and see if any of the members of the Friends are still around. And even in the whaling period, of course, there's, people will go see if you can meet, Captain Pollard. Maybe Captain Pollard's around and you'll spy him. But once tourists start coming here and there's a tourist economy, there is this idea that you're going to go try and see the local characters. And there are certain people on island who then cultivate for themselves an image of being a local character so that people will come see them, and then they make a living with that. They host clam bakes, or they do tours. There's many, many examples of this, of which these 3 people are just the tip of the iceberg. I mentioned earlier Captain William Baxter, who gave wagon tours. This is him with the figurehead from the Shenunga. He again, I mean, he probably was a somewhat eccentric character, but he was made even more so by the fact that he could make a living being that and showing people around the island. David Gorham Hussey, the man in the lower photograph, a local dentist and owner with his wife of a rental accommodation for visitors, appeared in drawings and in photographs and in postcards as the typical Quaker man. And this, in fact, this is Henry Wire, the photographer, taking the most stereotypical photograph possible of this man, dressed as you might see him walking down the street, so that you will recognize him walking down the street, dressed in his old-fashioned clothing. And then we have the woman sitting in her rocking chair. This is Lydia Macy Hussey. And this is actually a really interesting story. So she was a very respected elder member of the Society of Friends here on island. She did, in fact, dress in this very conservative, by this point, slightly old-fashioned way as an expression of her faith. And this is a photograph of a painting. The photograph is by Henry Wire. The painting is by Alexander Severins. And this was published, titled A Nantucket Grandmother. And it was sold as postcards, it was sold as frames. You could buy this as like, did you meet a Nantucket grandmother? Did you see one of these interiors and the person who was in it? And the really interesting thing about this celebration of Lydia Hussey is that she's long dead by the time this is created. Wire took a picture of her alive in this chair, set up doing knitting, clearly staged. He also took pictures of an interior, not sure if this was hers or not, but he took pictures of this interior. He laid all those photographs out in front of Alexander Severins, who created the painting of this stereotypical image. And there are other examples of this. There's a postcard that was, grandmother's bedroom with the characteristic antique pieces of furniture. We have a lot of those pieces of furniture in our collection here. James Walter Folger, the artist and carver, made an entire living creating sentimental scenes just like this, all appropriately sized to put in your travel bag and carry on the steamship home as a souvenir of your visit. And so this idea that you would visit and see the local characters isn't quite the case anymore, but the idea that maybe people watching is part of summer, that's still true. And we have a lot of artifacts about that in the collection. This lovely group of people, all carrying, there's two women have rackets. They've got the water painted in behind them in the studio. He's got his little summer cap on. These are like, very much summer people waiting to be seen. A little bit less assuming, but very happy part of summer is you're gonna go to the beach with your picnic, with your friends, and you're gonna see who else is there, and maybe you'll bump into people and you'll meet people new. I think that is as true historically as it is today. And so again, going to see and be seen and to visit your friends and that whole sort of social side of summer, there's more to this than I can get into right now, but I want to give you a little taste of that and some of the diversity of the things we have in our photography collection related to this. And then I think most crucially, I want to sort of round us out with the very important notion that the people who are here during the summer are many of them are working. That there's multiple sides to the summer experience. There's definitely a relaxation, come to your summer home, come for a week away, come enjoy the island, but that experience is made possible by the work of many, many people. And that has been the case for a long time. At the risk of echoing some things I said earlier, the need for people to come and make summer possible for all the rest of us is a vital part of this story. And so unfortunately, we don't know the names of these two women here in the background who, based on their dress, are presumed to be the servants who've come with this summer family. But the Nantucket long had a very thriving African American community, Native American community, and intermixed community of people of color who came here to work in the whaling industry, later people who came to work in the cranberry bogs and for other purposes. And there is a history of the people who came for whaling, the black people who came for whaling, moved away when whaling deteriorated and when Southern politics became dangerous to be a sailor traveling through those waters. But then a different black community emerged on Nantucket, largely out of people coming here working for the summer, either coming with families and then being tied into other community here, or there's work to do. And so there is a whole history to that, which I would love to get into in more detail in future. But I think it's very important to stress that in talking about summer on Nantucket, we are not just talking about the people able to live on Brant Point, although that's a huge part of the story and it's a very important part of the story. We're also talking about everybody else who's here working. And it's not just drudgery. I don't want to come across as being, that work is bad in any way. There's a lot of fun to that. There are people who choose to do it. You go around the community and you talk to people, and the people who came here to work and they worked in their restaurant, they have these just glowing things to say about remembering the restaurants they worked in, the hotels they worked in, the people they met, the experiences that they had in their off hours, going to the Chicken Box. Chicken Box was open on the days that domestic servants were off work historically. There's a lot of history to that. So I particularly like this picture of the waitresses, posed around this car for that reason as well. And then today, we are featuring in the show a certain amount of contemporary photography of people working on island and sort of the effort that goes into behind the scenes to make things happen, be that landscaping or working in the food service industry. Or I particularly like this view a lot of this. You see where the tables are going for the evening and bringing those flowers together and sort of celebrating the local island, and making this experience possible. And so with that, I want to invite everybody to come back. We have a members opening next Thursday for the show. The show opens to the public on Friday. There are many, many artifacts in the show. I have not had a chance in my slides to show you what I think is probably the centerpiece of the show, which is 10 dressed figures of people in garments from the collection representing summer, the multiple sides of summer. We've got some great collections from the 1960s and 70s of items from the Nantucket looms that we collected in recent years that have not yet been on exhibit. We are delighted to be able to bring those out on exhibit. We have Nantucket designs for children. We have all these great costume items we've been dying to show, and that is actually a centerpiece of this. And a lot of these topics that I've talked about sort of whirl around this center display. We also commissioned this poster from an artist wanting to sort of celebrate the colors and some of the aspects of summer here. And we've included in the middle the two men who are shore casting. It really is the local working men who like to shorecast from Brant Point while the summer swirls around them. So I think that's quite important. Anyway, thank you very much for coming. I'm happy to answer any questions or elucidate anything that I may have skipped along past too quickly. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. So now we'll take questions from the audience. If you could raise your hand and wait until a mic gets to you, then we'll accept any questions.
In discussing the allure of getting people to come here, is there any discussion of Walter Beinecke and his idea of so-called Williamsburging Nantucket during the 60s and 70s? Because I think that is a major force that kept this from becoming McDonald's and Burger King and other things such as that.
Yeah, that is a huge part of the story. We do touch on that. We don't get into as much depth on that as that story probably deserves. One of the things that I discovered by tackling this project, by wanting to do a sort of capsule history, a capsule show that sort of shows you that summer has a history, is that you get into these topics where you can do an entire show about just that. And I think Beinecke's influence here is hard to understate. There are multiple sides and ways of looking at it. And there's also a whole history of that he built on. So Beinecke is well known for having sort of consolidated a real estate portfolio, for having worked very hard to sort of, we don't want to be selling hot dogs, we want to be selling higher end experiences, we want to sort of have fewer people come and have those people be having a better experience, but also be people who can pay more for that experience. But a lot of his work was built on earlier work done by, her name's gonna go right out of my head right now, Florence Lang, who in the 1920s bought up a lot of real estate in town in order to keep the working waterfront going. And she's the one who introduced the art colony and the artist cottages and the Easy Street Gallery in order to bring in tourist revenue that supported the local economy in the off-season. And it was her real estate portfolio that Beinecke bought that formed the foundation of his efforts, which in some respects were in a slightly different direction, since he decided we don't need a working harbor, we need a yacht harbor, and the redevelopment of all of that. So my point being, we do touch on that in the show, but we don't go into it in as much depth as it obviously deserves. Probably because there's all these branches of it that I really want to talk about, and there was no way to do that completely.
I have two questions, if I could. One is a practical. When the exhibit is up and running to the public, will there be a narrated portion similar to what you've done for us tonight, or is it a walk around, self-guided?
The exhibit is self-guided. We are doing gallery tours at different points through the summer. We don't have any audio tour of it at the moment, and we haven't actually considered developing one, but that's an interesting idea. My hope with the show is that you get the main points of it by walking through it. It is largely a visual experience. There's less, I've certainly written things for this show, but there's less to read than there is to actually just see. And I'm hoping that people will come away with the sort of flavor of what I've been able to present tonight on their own through it.
My second question, and I guess this goes to the 1860 changeover period when the community said we need to preserve what we have. We're going to do history. We're going to do tourism. We're going to protect what our look is. At what point was keeping the cobblestones decided upon as something to retain?
I'm going to get the exact date wrong because I didn't look that up before I came, but the cobblestones were heavily debated. And there are certain streets where the cobblestones were covered up, and then people were like, no, don't do that. And they uncovered them. India Street, in particular, being one of those. But there are arguments, particularly when the automobile arrives in the 1920s, that, well, the cobblestones have only been there for about 50 years. They're really not that historic. Then they're really a hindrance to getting up Main Street. We should remove them. We should cover them up. And there's a little bit of town inertia that doesn't do that. There are talented people on island at that point who know how to repair the road, who can put the cobblestones back in a way that's not quite so terrible. Unfortunately, that's not the case at the moment. Most of our cobblestone streets here are not actually laid the correct way, aside from just not really being maintained. So I would answer your question by saying really in the 1920s is when that argument comes to the fore, that those are an integral part. It's not just the shingled houses, it's not just the windmill, but that part of the landscape is really a big part of it, sort of the 1920s. Anything else? Unfortunately, not tonight. We've got a whole bunch of stuff in the way. I would love to show you. I'd love to show you tonight, but unfortunately, no. Yeah.
How many mid-century houses were lost, or how many were built in that time before when they could, I guess, get away with that?
So an exact accounting of that hasn't yet been done, and we are hoping that some work that University of Florida and the PIN program here in Nantucket are undertaking, we might be able to collaborate with them to get some better numbers on that. There's certainly, for years and years, the sort of historic landscape of town, highly valued, people love it, people try and preserve it. There's a bit of movement around, there's adding on the back, there's a lot of that. Outside of town, anything goes. Do what you want. There's no restrictions, there's no zoning, there's no building permits until the 1970s. Do what you want. And so after World War II, when there's an explosion of development, there are a lot of mid-century buildings that are built here. Both literal mid-century, because they're built in the 50s, but then also stylistically mid-century. Particularly in Nantucket and Tom Nevers, there's a bit more of what we might now call sort of experimental design. There are 3 houses by Robert Venturi on island. There's at least 2, probably more, by Hugh Newell Jacobson. And a lot of those, not so much the Venturi and Jacobson designs, but a lot of these other ones have been taken down because their lots are so valuable that people would rather have the modern house that they want with all of its amenities than that thing. And so a lot of that has come down less, I think, to style and more to just wanting more square footage. But there's a lot of research left to be done on that. One thing I discovered in working on this show is that there are great resources here, published resources about the history of Nantucket architecture. I mean, I knew that already, but if you want to know about Victorian infill buildings in town and how they then relate to the building of new bungalows and cottages on Cliff Road, that hasn't been written yet. They're ignored. Like, it's not important. They're not from the whaling times. And I think there's a huge story to be told there, going all the way up into like Fisher's Landing and all of the debates about Fisher's Landing and Tristram's Landing, those developments out in Nantucket. In fact, making the entire island a landmark district and not just discrete parts of it is entirely a reaction to suburban development on island and solving what, in essence, was a zoning problem with aesthetic regulation. Yes.
You showed us some beautiful old large buildings that disappeared. Was it mostly weather that took them down, or was it just changes in style or fortune?
It's a little bit of both. And one of the reasons I wanted to do that little portfolio of the hotels is to really show that there used to be quite a number of larger hotels here, and that by and large they are mostly gone. A lot of that is destruction through weather. Just these large wood buildings are susceptible to decay. They're very difficult to update as people's expectations change. You know, you come here in the 1870s and you stay at a big hotel at Surfside, and you're fine going to a bathroom down the hall and sharing a separate room that's got the bathtub in it. But you're less likely to do, if that hotel survived today, there's no way anybody would stay there. And so they're very difficult to update, they're difficult to maintain, and they get taken down because it's just cheaper to take it down than to leave it. There was a moment here in the 1980s where town meeting decided that there should be no large hotels outside of town. And so that type of development has been squashed entirely by local choice, if there were an interest to do it. So that, you know, that lovely hotel out in Sconset, looming over the beach, which wore out and was taken down, outlived its economic purpose. At the moment, you can't recreate that, and people would definitely like scream and holler if you tried to. But you know, one thing that comes to my mind is like if you look at the new school buildings that have been built here, and sort of the aesthetic debates on like, well, what should a large building look like here? Oh, we could never build apartment buildings on Nantucket. There never were big buildings. Obviously, that's not true. There were definitely big buildings here, and there's big residential buildings that were here. They're just not here anymore. Anyone else? Yes, Melinda.
I always thought the Dreamland was floated across and ended up right where it was, but I think I heard you say tonight it had 2 other locations before it ended up where the Dreamland is now.
That's correct.
So where did it go before where it is now?
So it was originally built as a Friends Meeting House on Main Street. So when you walk up Main Street past the Pacific Bank, on the left, there's a little bit of a hill, and there are 2 infill late 19th century houses. One's now a hotel, masquerading as a colonial revival house. That's where the large Quaker Meeting House was on Main Street, one of the large Quaker Meeting Houses. It was there. And then they dismantled it, and they took it out to Brant Point and built it into the Nantucket Hotel. And then when that hotel reached the end of its service life, that's when they floated it across the harbor, and it became the Red Men's Hall. And the Red Men's Hall was used largely for motion picture screening and became the Dreamland. There's not a whole lot of the original structure of the building left in what's now the Dreamland, unfortunately, but if you go up to that second floor room that, you know, in the back, all that's from the Quaker Meeting House on Main Street. So really fascinating. Yeah.
Hi. Is there any mention in the exhibit about what was happening on First Point? The Surfside development proposal looks a lot like what might have been happening at the turn of the century, or proposed at the turn of the century out there. And I know there was some activity.
Yes. So that is something, we had hoped to cover more of that story in this show, but instead we've shunted it all over to Hadwin House, to our map exhibit. And so in the map exhibit, which I highly recommend everybody go see, also opening Memorial Day weekend, we're showing some of the developments on Coatue, some of the developments out in Nantucket at Smith's Point, Monomoy Heights, Sunset Park. We have a whole variety of different real estate plats from our collection that relate to these late 19th century efforts to develop basically cottage lots on places like Coteau or the South Shore. We have good photography of these in the collection. We've got a few artifacts. We have a sales book from Surfside. And yeah, it's amazing stuff, really amazing stuff. And none of it really worked. So yes, we do have that covered in our exhibits this year.
All right, thank you, Michael, once again.
Thank you.
So I just want to thank the Tuppence Harris Foundation for funding all of the video recordings of our public programs, and also the NHA members for supporting our free public events.